Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Psychology with Eren. Today we'll be learning about conditioning. Today we'll be discussing operant conditioning, the concept of law and effect, operant behavior, ABRs, classical conditioning, stimulus and response, and how they all work together to develop the conditioning of psychology. Basic understanding will allow you to distinguish between the two types of conditioning. Average understanding will allow you to understand the difference between stimulus and response. An entire topic comprehension will allow you to understand who was involved in creating these theories. Let's get started with operant conditioning. The concept of law and effect was developed by Edward Thorndike, and the way this was developed was using a Thorndike puzzle box. Essentially, a cat was trapped inside of the box, and Thorndike placed fish treats at the other end of the box in order to incentivize the cat to escape out of it. Now, the concept of law and effect simply states that a positive reward will make the creature or subject likely to repeat the action, and on the inverse of that, negative rewards are not likely to be repeated because they don't want to experience the same negativity. And the concept of operant behavior simply states that behavior can change the environment positively or negatively. The researcher that founded this theory was B.F. Skinner, and the way he determined it was using this thing called a Skinner box or an operant chamber. For example, a rat is inside a box and has the option between different buttons or levers, and the different levers can provide the subject with different things, such as food, light, or drugs. And depending on the circumstances of the rat, which are tested at various levels, they can actually see how the rat will react, if at all, when they push those buttons. Moving on to the theory, operant conditioning relies on these things called ABRs, which are antecedents, behavior, and responses. Antecedents are the stimuli or the cues, responses are consequences of the cues, and the behavior is obviously the action or lack thereof of the subject. Now, going a little bit deeper into this, we can see that cues or the stimuli are things that we can see, hear, or smell. Tasting and feeling aren't usually associated with this, but it definitely could be a possibility depending on the research that's being conducted. Cues can be either positive or negative, and the responses are dependent on the cues. The consequences of the cues can be good or bad, and depending on what's going on will determine the behavior that's going to happen. If it's a good cue that is starting, the action that is creating the good cue is going to increase. If a bad cue is stopping, the same logic applies. And on the flip side of that, good cues stopping or bad cues starting will make the subject reduce what they're doing to create the negativity. The creature or subject that's being evaluated will naturally want less consequences in their life if they're negative. If they're good consequences, they're going to continue. Now I want to put what we've learned so far into practice. I want you to imagine that you are in the best bakery in your town, and you happen to walk in one early morning. You look at the display case, and right in the middle, you see this loaf of bread. Gross, I know, and I'm sorry, but it proves for a very valuable lesson. The ABRs are very simple to understand it if you had the same reaction as I did, which was disgust. The first thing we noticed was a disgusting, gross, and moldy piece of bread with crummy old sesame seeds on it. The visual was not good, it was negative. And with regards to response, that is the beginning of a bad cue. If we were in the actual bakery and we saw this disgusting and moldy piece of bread, we would likely stop doing what we were doing, which was being inside that bakery, and leave, because nobody wants to eat that disgusting piece of moldy bread. And leaving, the action of leaving, is considered the behavior. And if you followed along so far, this is pretty much the entire gist of operant conditioning theory. I want to switch gears a bit here and discuss classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning. The biggest overarching theme with classical conditioning is the conditioning process. The conditioning process is behavior that can become innate when two stimuli are paired under the correct conditions. The researcher that founded this was Ivan Pavlov, and its discovery was entirely an accident. What happened was Pavlov was opening a bag of meat powder and realized that the dog that he was going to give the meat powder was salivating before even smelling or even tasting the treats. Pavlov recognized that the dog understood that when the bag was being opened for the treats, that he knew that some sort of reward was going to happen. And what's interesting was how he did it. It's kind of gross in my opinion, but what happened was that Pavlov put these tubes surgically onto the dog and would actually measure how much saliva was coming out of the dog's mouth. I wouldn't imagine doing that to Fido, but clearly Pavlov was interested enough to actually do it. Okay, this is where you really need to pay attention because it's easy to get lost here. I'm going to go slowly and try to explain things easily. A neutral stimulus is something that creates no response upon its completion. An unconditioned stimulus is something that creates a response innately by the creature or subject that's being tested and creates a response or reaction or a reflex. In classical conditioning theory, we take a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus to create a reaction or a reflex or a response. And the way this is done is that the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together and constantly repeated until a neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus creates a conditioned response because by itself, the neutral stimulus doesn't actually cause any reaction, but once it's paired with something enough, that's when it creates that reaction or reflex. Without any training, there would be no response to it, but a conditioned response is because the creature or subject is conditioned to react a certain way. If you're a little bit confused here, don't worry too much. Some of the examples will actually make it easier to understand. The neutral stimulus is the box, and the unconditioned stimulus is the donut. The donut naturally causes these children joy because it's sweet, it's sugary, pretty colors. The box itself is nothing special, it's just a box. In this example, we come to assume that children understand that with the box comes a donut. The children understand that if they want to get a donut, they have to open the box. So let's say we're in an elementary school and a teacher has a box of donuts in their hand walking around campus. We can naturally assume in this example that children will be around the teacher because they love the sound of the box and the donuts rattling inside of it, and they love the look of the box because they know what's inside of it is a reward. It's an incentive. In this example, I want you to identify the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is the actual turkey leg and thought of dinner time. Because these prisoners have become accustomed to the sounds of bars clanking as dinner time, the conditioned stimulus is the sound of the bars. And the reason that is because alone the sound of bars doesn't create a natural response to typical people, but rather because they've become conditioned to the sound of bars clanking as dinner time, it's become a pattern, a systemic behavior. They've come to associate that sound with dinner time. And this applies to real world beyond prisoners and dogs and stuff. It actually happens to people that are in hospitals. And here's a good example of that. In this example, a patient is given apples during an intensive treatment cycle at their local hospital. And when I say intensive treatment cycle, I'm talking they're hospitalized, they can only eat certain foods because of their ailment. Maybe they're on a clear food diet, maybe they're on chemotherapy and they're eating the same things over and over again because that's what their stomach can tolerate. I want you to think for a moment about some of the potential conditioned stimulus that could happen as a result of this treatment. If you guess that the patient will come to dislike the taste of apples because it reminds them of their intense treatment cycle, then you would have guessed correctly, and proud props to you, you got it. And the reason why this is because when people are conditioned to eat certain foods under intense pressure, it'll jog up memories. Now, I also want you to think for just a second how the patient would react to bananas. Assuming that the patient is typical and has no prior interactions with bananas with other intense treatment cycles, we can assume that the patient actually enjoys bananas or tolerates them enough. And the reason this is because classical conditioning targets specific cues, specific stimuli, and isn't as broad as compared to operant conditioning. So here are the key takeaways if you just want the summed up version into one single bite. Operant conditioning requires the brain to utilize what it's experienced previously in its life to make choices about a variety of different topics. Classical conditioning requires consistent and constant training to be regulated about certain stimuli. It's not nearly as broad as operant conditioning. Stimuli can be neutral, unconditioned, or conditioned, and responses can be unconditioned or conditioned. Responses are just dependent on what would a natural subject do without any training beforehand. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. See you next time.